Hopefully you recall from the previous thought primer this concept of consistency that we touched on. We talked about the need for our ethical system to achieve or strive for consistency. That is, to reflect the values of impartiality and universality, to give equal consideration to people in similar situations, unless there's some morally relevant distinction that we could point to that justifies giving people unequal consideration. Okay, so keep that in mind as you watch this lecture. So you may be aware that back in the 70s there was this controversy surrounding Ford Pintos, the car Ford Pintos. And the story was that there was a design flaw in Ford Pintos, in particular their gas tanks, that made them particularly susceptible to exploding into flames when rear-ended, and so many people had died these horrific deaths in these exploding, ugly Pinto cars. That's not exactly the story. The story is more along the lines of there was a fuel delivery system that was used not just in Ford Pintos, but in a lot of other cars as well, that was faulty and made those cars, whichever cars had those fuel systems or trucks, susceptible to explosion on impact. And so when car manufacturers started learning about this, these exploding vehicles, they decided, okay, we've got to figure out how much it would cost to recall all of these cars with this fuel system so that we can modify it, make it safer, versus the cost of allowing these cars to continue to explode at some rate and cause injuries and loss of life. And so they did what insurance companies would do, right? They kind of calculated out how many cars do we think are going to explode each year and how many people are going to be injured and killed in those explosions versus how much is it going to cost to recall all these cars and fix them so that they don't explode, okay? And this is what they came up with. Okay, we can fix all of these cars' fuels that have this fuel system for $11. This is like 1970 something dollars, okay? So for $11, we can fix these cars. But there's 12.5 million of these cars and trucks out there that have this fuel system. It's not just Pintos, it's a whole bunch of other kinds of cars, makes and models of cars. And so therefore the cost of eliminating this problem of the faulty fuel system in order to save these lives is going to be about $137 million. Okay? The design changes would then save 180 people from dying and 180 people from serious injuries every single year going forward. And this organization said, okay, well, what's the value of that? And they said, well, that's about $49.5 million. Okay. Now, the rumor was that Ford Pinto, the evil Ford Pinto people behind closed doors said, how much are the lawsuits going to cost us versus how much to fix the cars? Oh, gosh, the lawsuits are going to cost that much more. Let's go ahead the fixing the cars is going to cost that more than the lawsuits. Let's tolerate the lawsuits. But that's not actually what they did. What they did is a much more dispassionate analysis of what would be the benefit to society as a whole. So when we have these workers leave the workforce, when we have these providers these families suddenly having lost their provider, and so on and so forth. And so they calculated that out. What would be the benefit to society? Okay? And so you can see the utilitarian thinking here, particularly a sort of Bentham version of utilitarian thinking that isn't really taking much into account beyond the numbers here, the dollars. Okay? Now, when we look at this, there's something that strikes us a little, callous, right? I mean, it seems like this thinking is missing something. It seems like it's missing the real value of those lives that could be saved, that are now going to be lost. Okay? Now, think about this situation as it relates to one closer to home, specifically the safety corridor between Eureka and Arcata. So I have a proposal for you. And the proposal is this. Because every year there are people who get run over and killed on the safety corridor, and there are people who get T-boned coming out of Bayside Cutoff or Indianola Cutoff and die and get injured in the safety corridor, I propose installing a series of those big speed humps that make it really difficult for a car to travel at more than 10 or 15 miles an hour without it becoming seriously damaged. And I propose putting those same large speed humps out on Samoa Boulevard and on Old Arcata Road. And what that means is that if you're going to get to Eureka from the north, or you're going to go north from Eureka, you're going to be traveling at a much, much lesser rate of speed than you're able to travel now. But the benefit, of course, is that all of the people that would ordinarily die and be injured in car collisions because the cars are traveling at a much faster speed, they're going to live and they're not going to be injured. Okay? Now, what's the cost here? Well, it's now going to take longer to get between Eureka and Arcata. Okay? And that's going to have a whole bunch of implications. One is, well, the cost of moving products across the county is going to get much more expensive because you're going to be paying workers for more of their time simply to travel those miles that they can now travel relatively quickly. So maybe a 10-minute trip on the safety corridor now becomes an hour-long trip on the safety corridor, 30 minutes or however long it would be. And that also means that these people who are driving back and forth, I'm driving into CR, I'm driving back home from CR, every day that's less time that I now have to spend on my family because now I'm spending it on the safety corridor going 10 miles an hour. And you're going to have less time to study if you have to travel anywhere north of Eureka down to CR's campus because instead of studying, now you're going to be sitting in your car traveling at 10 or 15 miles an hour. How many lives are too many lives for us to be willing to make these kinds of sacrifices? Okay, so think back to the Ford Pinto situation. There's something that we're kind of mortified about when we look at the callousness of the calculating cost and benefit there. It seems so cruel, right? That we do this cold heart monetary calculation. Okay, well here, with the safety corridor question, we've got the monetary aspect of our calculation, but now we've sort of factored in a time variable as well. Are those two variables sufficient to justify keeping the speed limit where it's at, knowing that doing so will cost people's lives, that will cause people to get injuries? Okay, so maybe think about your responses to the Ford Pinto question and to the safety corridor proposal that I've offered you, and see if your responses to those two situations are consistent. And if they're not, is there something that you could point to that would justify the responses that you have to these two situations being different?